The sun was setting over the quiet suburban streets, casting long shadows on the pavement as a faint breeze rustled through the trees. It was the kind of evening that felt peaceful, almost timeless, until the roar of a motorcycle shattered the calm. A sleek black bike zipped down the road, its rider leaning low, the engine growling like a beast unleashed. People turned their heads, some annoyed, others curious, but no one dared to approach the biker. He had a reputation. After all, Jake, the town's self-proclaimed daredevil, a man who thrived on attention and thrived even more on chaos. Jake wasn't the kind of guy who worried about consequences. To him, life was a game, and everyone else was just a pawn. He lived for the thrill, the rush, and most of all, the reactions he could provoke. Tonight, he had his sights set on a new target, a quiet, unassuming man who lived in a small house at the edge of the neighborhood. Everyone knew him as Mr. Harris, the elderly veteran who walked with a slight limp and always wore a faded army jacket. He was a man of few words, but his presence commanded respect, even if he never asked for it. Jake had other ideas. To him, Mr. Harris was just another challenge, another chance to stir up trouble and bask in the chaos. "Let's see how the old man handles this," Jake muttered to himself, a sly grin spreading across his face as he revved his engine. His plan wasn't just a prank, it was a spectacle. Something that would have the whole neighborhood talking for days, maybe even weeks. As Jake approached the small house, he spotted Mr. Harris sitting on his porch, the man's weathered hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee. He looked peaceful, almost lost in thought, as if the world outside his little porch didn't exist. Jake saw this as the perfect moment. With a sudden burst of speed, he roared past the house, the deafening sound of his motorcycle breaking the stillness. Mr. Harris flinched, spilling a bit of his coffee, but he didn't look up. Jake frowned. That wasn't the reaction he was hoping for. Determined to get a rise out of the old man, Jake circled back. This time, he skidded to a stop right in front of the house, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Mr. Harris slowly looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. Jake felt a flicker of unease but quickly brushed it off. "Nice evening, isn't it, old man?" he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Mr. Harris didn't respond. He simply took another sip of his coffee, his gaze steady and unwavering. Jake felt a surge of irritation. "What's the matter? Cat, got your tongue?" he taunted, revving his engine again. The noise was deafening, but Mr. Harris didn't so much as blink. It was as if the man was made of stone. Jake's friends, who'd been watching from a distance, started laughing. "Come on, Jake. Scare him a little," one of them shouted. Jake smirked. He loved an audience. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small firecracker. It wasn't dangerous, just loud enough to make a statement. He lit it and tossed it onto the porch, expecting Mr. Harris to jump or yell or do anything that would give Jake the reaction he craved. But what happened next wasn't what Jake or anyone else expected. The firecracker went off with a sharp crack, and for a split second, everything was still. Then Mr. Harris stood up. Slowly, deliberately, he set his coffee cup down and stepped off the porch. There was something in his eyes, something that made Jake's smirk falter. The old man didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He looked calm. Too calm. Jake's heart started to race, though he couldn't explain why. "What's the matter, old man? Can't take a joke?" he said, his voice not quite as confident as before. Mr. Harris didn't respond. He just kept walking, his steps measured and purposeful, until he was standing right in front of Jake. For the first time, Jake noticed the scars on the man's hands, the way his posture was straight despite his limp, and the quiet strength in his gaze. Mr. Harris leaned in slightly, his voice low but steady. "Son," he said, "you have no idea who you're messing with." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The laughter of his friends faded into the background, replaced by an uneasy silence. For the first time in his life, Jake felt something he wasn't used to fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from danger, but the kind that comes from realizing you've underestimated someone in a way you can't take back. And that's when Mr. Harris said something that changed everything, a single sentence that left Jake and everyone else frozen in place. But what he said and what happened next is something you'll have to wait to find out. Because this story is far from over. Jake's breath caught in his throat as Mr. Harris's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. He tried to keep his cool, to laugh it off like he always did, but there was something about the way the old man looked at him steady, unflinching, that made his usual bravado feel hollow. The laughter of his friends had stopped entirely, replaced by an uneasy quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. Jake's hand instinctively gripped the handlebars of his bike, his knuckles whitening. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do. Mr. Harris didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Jake's, as if he were looking straight through him. It wasn't anger in his gaze, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that made Jake feel small in a way he couldn't quite explain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the old man straightened up, brushing off his jacket as though the entire exchange had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "You think this is a game?" Mr. Harris said, his voice calm but with an edge that made the hair on Jake's arms stand up. "You think you can ride around, make noise, and throw your little toys, and it won't matter. But everything matters, son. Every choice, every action, it all comes back around eventually." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to snap back, to say something clever or cutting, but nothing came to mind. Instead, he found himself watching as Mr. Harris turned and walked back toward his porch, his limp barely noticeable now. The old man picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and sat back down in his chair as if nothing had happened. Jake's friends, sensing the tension, started to shuffle awkwardly. Maybe we should head out," one of them muttered. Jake didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much bigger than he'd realized. As they rode off, the roar of their bikes filling the night, Jake couldn't stop glancing back at the small house. Mr. Harris was still sitting there, watching them go. It wasn't until they were halfway across town that Jake finally spoke. "What's his deal?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Who? The old guy?" one of his friends replied. "Man, forget about him. He's just some cranky vet. Probably thinks he's still in the war or something." Jake didn't respond. He couldn't forget about him, not after the way the man had looked at him. There was something about Mr. Harris that didn't add up. Jake had always prided himself on being able to read people, to know exactly how far he could push them before they snapped. But with Mr. Harris, it was different. It was like the old man wasn't playing by the same rules. Over the next few days, Jake couldn't get the encounter out of his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mr. Harris's face, heard his voice, felt the weight of his words. It didn't make sense. Jake had pulled stunts like this 100 times before, and no one had ever gotten under his skin like this. He started asking around, trying to piece together who Mr. Harris really was. Most people didn't know much. "He's just an old guy," one neighbor said with a shrug. "Keeps to himself. Nice enough, I guess." Others mentioned his military service in passing, but no one seemed to know any details. It wasn't until Jake ran into Mrs. Evans, the neighborhood busybody, that he got his first real clue. "Oh, Mr. Harris," she said, her eyes lighting up at the chance to share some gossip. "He's a mystery, that one. Moved here about 10 years ago. Never talks about his past, but I've heard things. Some say he was a war hero. Others say he left the military under complicated circumstances." Jake's curiosity only grew. He started spending more time near Mr. Harris's house, watching from a distance, trying to figure out what made the old man tick. At first it felt like a game, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. But the more he watched, the more he realized how little he actually knew. Mr. Harris's days were quiet and unremarkable. He'd sit on his porch in the mornings with his coffee, go for a short walk in the afternoons, and spend his evenings reading or attending to the small garden in his backyard. It was all so normal, so mundane, that it only made Jake more suspicious. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake decided to get closer. He parked his bike a few streets over and walked to Mr. Harris's house, staying in the shadows. The old man was on his porch as usual, but this time, he wasn't alone. A man in a suit stood in front of him, holding a briefcase. They were talking quietly, their voices too low for Jake to hear. Jake crept closer, his heart pounding. He crouched behind a bush, straining to catch snippets of their conversation. "Not safe anymore," the man in the suit was saying. "You know that? Mr. Harris shook his head. "I'm not running," he replied firmly. "You don't have to run," the man insisted. "But you can't stay here. Not after what happened." Jake's pulse quickened. What were they talking about? What had happened? He leaned in closer, trying to hear more, but just as he did, Mr. Harris's gaze shifted. His eyes locked onto Jake's hiding spot, and for a moment, it felt like time stopped. "Why don't you come out, son?" Mr. Harris said, his voice calm but commanding. "No point in hiding." Jake froze, his mind racing. How had the old man seen him? He'd been so careful. Slowly, reluctantly, he stood up and stepped out of the shadows. "I was just... passing by," Jake stammered, trying to sound casual. Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Passing by, huh?" He glanced at the man in the suite, who gave Jake a once-over before nodding slightly and walking away without another word. Jake watched him go, then turned back to Mr. Harris. "Who was that?" he asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Mr. Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Jake for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to tell him the truth. Finally, he said, "Someone who knows more than you do." Jake frowned. "About what? What?" The old man smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "About what happens when you push the wrong buttons." Jake opened his mouth to ask more, but Mr. Harris held up a hand. "That's enough questions for one night. Go home, son. And next time, think twice before you go sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Jake hesitated, torn between pressing for answers and backing off. In the end, he nodded reluctantly and turned to leave. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was only scratching the surface of something much bigger and much darker than he'd ever imagined. The days that followed were anything but normal for Jake. No matter how hard he tried to push it out of his mind, the encounter with Mr. Harris and the mysterious man in the suit lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. He replayed the scene over and over, dissecting every word, every glance, every unspoken implication. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly understood. Who was Mr. Harris, really? What had he meant about things coming back around? And why did that man in the suit seem so urgent, so serious? Jake's friends had moved on, laughing off the whole incident as just another prank gone sideways. But Jake couldn't let it go. He started digging deeper, asking questions around town, even visiting the local library to scour old newspapers for any mention of Mr. Harris. At first, his search turned up nothing. Mr. Harris was practically a ghost, no family, no visitors, no history anyone could point to. It was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere a decade ago and quietly settled into the neighborhood. Then Jake stumbled across something unexpected. Buried in the archives of a small-town paper was a brief mention of a man named Thomas Harris, a decorated veteran who had been involved in a covert military operation years ago. The details were vague, but the article hinted at some kind of classified mission that had gone wrong, leaving Harris as the sole survivor. The story was quickly buried, overshadowed by other news, but it was enough to send a chill down Jake's spine. What kind of mission had it been? And why was it classified? Jake couldn't stop himself from imagining the worst secret wars, dangerous enemies, things most people would never know about. The more he thought about it, the more he began to understand why Mr. Harris had seemed so unshakable that night. This wasn't just an old man with a quiet life. This was someone who had seen things, done things, that most people couldn't even imagine. Jake's curiosity became an obsession. He started spending his nights parked near Mr. Harris's house, watching from a distance, hoping to catch another glimpse of the man in the suit or overhear something that might give him answers. But for days, nothing happened. Mr. Harris went about his routine as usual, calm and unbothered, as if he hadn't noticed Jake lurking nearby. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late, well past midnight, when Jake saw them two men dressed in dark clothing, moving silently through the shadows toward Mr. Harris's house. They weren't from the neighborhood, Jake was sure of that. Something about the way they moved, quick and deliberate, set off alarm bells in his mind. They weren't here for a friendly visit. Jake's heart raced as he watched them approach the house. One of the men crouched near a window, pulling out what looked like a small toolkit. The other stood guard, scanning the street for any signs of movement. Jake ducked lower in his hiding spot, his mind spinning. What should he do? Call the police? Confront them? Or just stay hidden and hope they didn't see him? Before he could decide, the front door opened. Mr. Harris stepped out, his expression calm, but his posture tense, like a coiled spring. He didn't say a word, but the way he stood there, staring at the intruders, was enough to make them freeze. "You've got the wrong house," Mr. Harris said, his voice low and steady. The men exchanged a glance, and Jake could see the hesitation in their movements. For a moment, it seemed like they might back off. But then one of them stepped forward, pulling something from his pocket, a small black object that glinted faintly in the moonlight. Jake's breath caught. He didn't know what it was, but he had a feeling it wasn't good. He wanted to shout, to warn Mr. Harris, but his voice caught in his throat. The man took another step forward. "You know why we're here?" he said, his tone sharp. "You can't hide forever." Mr. Harris didn't flinch. "I'm not hiding," he replied. "But you might want to think twice about what you're doing." The tension was unbearable. Jake felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The second man shifted nervously, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. And then it happened. In a blur of motion too fast for Jake to fully process, Mr. Harris moved. One moment he was standing on the porch, calm and unbothered, and the next he was in front of the first man, disarming him with a swift, practiced motion. The black object clattered to the ground, and before the second man could react, Mr. Harris had him pinned against the wall. Jake stared in disbelief. The old man moved like a soldier, every action precise and efficient. It was like watching a scene from a movie, except this was real. The first man scrambled to his feet, but Mr. Harris didn't even look at him. "Tell your boss," he said, his voice cold and steady, "that I'm not interested. And if he sends anyone else, they won't be leaving." The men didn't need to be told twice. They bolted into the night, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. For a long moment, Mr. Harris stood there, watching the street, his posture still tense. Then, slowly, he turned and looked directly at Jake's hiding spot. "You can come out now," he said, his tone almost wary. Jake hesitated, his legs trembling as he stepped out from the shadows. He felt like a child caught sneaking cookies from the jar, but the look in Mr. Harris's eyes was far more serious. "You've been watching me," Mr. Harris said, his voice calm but firm. "Why?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he managed to stammer, I wanted to know who you are." Mr. Harris studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're in over your head, kid," he said. "Go home. Stay out of this. It's not your fight." But Jake started to protest, but Mr. Harris cut him off. "No buts," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Trust me, it's better that way." Jake wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in Mr. Harris's eyes stopped him. There was something there, something deep and unspoken, that told Jake he wasn't ready for the truth. Not yet. As Jake walked away, his mind raced with questions. Who were those men? What did they want? And why did Mr. Harris seem so certain that he couldn't handle the truth? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: whatever was happening, it was far bigger and far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Jake couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mr. Harris's face, calm and steady, even as danger loomed. He replayed the encounter with the intruders, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The old man wasn't just some retired veteran living out his days in peace. He was something else entirely, something Jake couldn't quite define. The next morning, Jake decided he couldn't let it go. He needed answers. Ignoring Mr. Harris's warning, he returned to the library, diving deeper into the archives. If the local papers didn't have what he was looking for, maybe the national ones did. After hours of searching, he found a brief mention in an old military journal detailing a covert operation known only as Project Sentinel. The article didn't give much away, but it listed a name, Captain Thomas Harris. Jake's pulse quickened as he read. The piece described a top-secret mission overseas, one that had ended in disaster. The details were classified, but the article hinted at betrayal, a double cross that had left Harris and his team stranded in hostile territory. Harris had been the only one to make it out alive. Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Was this what the intruders had been after? Was Mr. Harris hiding something from that mission, something people were still willing to kill for? The thought sent a chill down his spine. That evening, Jake found himself back near Mr. Harris's house, his curiosity outweighing his fear. The street was quiet, the soft hum of cicadas filling the air. Mr. Harris was on his porch, as usual, but this time he wasn't alone. A young woman stood next to him, her arms crossed, her face tight with worry. Jake moved closer, staying in the shadows. He couldn't hear everything they were saying, but fragments of their conversation reached him. "You said this was over," the woman said, her voice trembling. "It was," Mr. Harris replied, his tone firm but gentle. "But someone's digging. They're trying to bring it back." The woman shook her head. "You can't do this again. Not after what happened last time." "I don't have a choice," Mr. Harris said. "If I don't stop them, they'll come after you. After everyone." Jake's heart raced. Who was this woman? And what did she have to do with Mr. Harris's past? He leaned in closer, desperate to hear more, but his foot slipped on a loose rock, sending it skittering across the pavement. The sound was small, but it was enough. Mr. Harris's head snapped toward Jake's hiding spot, his eyes narrowing. "Come out," he called, his voice sharp. Jake hesitated, his pulse pounding in his ears. Slowly, he stepped out of the shadows, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "You again," Mr. Harris said, his expression unreadable. "Didn't I tell you to stay out of this?" "I couldn't," Jake admitted. "I found something. About Project Sentinel. About you. The woman's eyes widened, and she turned to Mr. Harris. "You told me it was buried," she said, her voice accusing. "It was," Mr. Harris replied, his gaze never leaving Jake. "Until now." Jake took a step closer. "I don't know what's going on, but those men last night, they weren't random, were they? They were looking for something. Something from your past." Mr. Harris sighed, the weight of the years seeming to settle on his shoulders. "You don't know what you're getting into, kid," he said. "This isn't some game. People have died for less." "Then tell me," Jake pressed. "If it's so dangerous, why are you still here?" "Why not run?" Mr. Harris hesitated, his eyes flicking to the woman. Finally, he said, "Because running doesn't fix anything. And some things are worth standing your ground for." Before Jake could respond, the sound of an engine roared in the distance. All three of them turned toward the street as a black SUV rounded the corner, its headlights cutting through the night. Inside, Mr. Harris said quickly, ushering the woman toward the house. He glanced at Jake. "That includes you." Jake didn't argue. He followed them inside, his heart pounding as Mr. Harris locked the door and pulled a heavy curtain across the window. The house was small and sparsely furnished, but there was a sense of purpose in the way everything was arranged, like Mr. Harris had been preparing for this moment. "Who are they?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. People who don't take no for an answer, Mr. Harris replied. He moved to a cabinet and pulled out a small metal box, flipping it open to reveal a pistol and a stack of old documents. The woman's face paled. You said you'd never use that again, she said. I don't plan to, Mr. Harris replied. But if they force my hand? The SUV came to a stop outside, and Jake heard the sound of doors opening, followed by heavy footsteps. He glanced at Mr. Harris, panic rising in his chest. What do we do? We wait, Mr. Harris said, his voice calm. And we hope they're smart enough to leave. But as the footsteps grew louder, Jake had a sinking feeling that hope wasn't going to be enough. The air inside the house was heavy with tension. Jake stood frozen near the door, his heart racing as the sound of footsteps grew closer. Mr. Harris remained calm, his hand resting lightly on the pistol he'd taken from the metal box. The woman, whose name Jake still didn't know, paced nervously near the window, peeking out through a gap in the curtain. They're coming up the driveway, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Stay away from the windows, Mr. Harris said firmly. He turned to Jake, his eyes sharp and steady. Whatever happens, you stay behind me. Got it? Jake nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He didn't know what he'd gotten himself into, but it was too late to back out now. A sharp knock echoed through the house, making them all jump. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from someone looking to chat. It was loud, forceful, and insistent. Thomas Harris, a voice called from outside, deep and commanding. We know you're in there. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. Mr. Harris didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the door. They're not here to negotiate, he said quietly. They're here to take something or someone. Jake's mind raced. What could they possibly want? The documents in the box? Mr. Harris himself? Whatever it was, it felt like the stakes couldn't be higher. The knocking came again, harder this time. Open the door, Harris. Last chance. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, Mr. Harris moved to the door and yanked it open. The men outside, two of them, dressed in dark suits, stiffened, clearly surprised by his boldness. What do you want? Mr. Harris asked, his voice calm but firm. One of the men stepped forward, holding up a photograph. Jake couldn't see it clearly from where he stood, but he caught a glimpse of a younger Mr. Harris standing with a group of men in military gear. You have something that belongs to us, the man said. Hand it over, and we'll leave you in peace. Mr. Harris didn't even glance at the photo. You know I don't have it, he said. I destroyed it years ago. Mr. Harris didn't even glance at the photo. You know I don't have it, he said. I destroyed it years ago. The man's jaw tightened. We both know that's a lie. If you'd destroyed it, we wouldn't be here. Jake felt his stomach drop. Whatever it was clearly something important, something worth sending armed men to retrieve. The second man stepped forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. This is your last warning, he said. Hand it over, or we'll tear this place apart until we find it. Mr. Harris didn't flinch. You can try, he said. But you won't like what happens next. The tension was unbearable. Jake's palms were sweaty, and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. He couldn't believe how calm Mr. Harris was, standing there like he had nothing to lose. Then, just as the men seemed ready to force their way inside, the woman stepped forward. Stop, she said, her voice trembling but determined. Everyone turned to look at her, and Jake saw something in her expression that he hadn't noticed before: fear, yes, but also resolve. You're wasting your time, she said, addressing the men. The files you're looking for aren't here. They never were. The lead man frowned. And you are? She's nobody, Mr. Harris said quickly, but the woman shook her head. I'm his daughter, she said, her voice steady now. And I know the truth about what you're looking for. Jake's eyes widened. Daughter! This was the first he'd heard of Mr. Harris having any family. But before he could process the revelation, the woman continued. The files were destroyed, she said. But not by him. By me. The men exchanged a glance, clearly caught off guard. Why should we believe you? One of them asked. Because I was there, she said. I saw what happened. And I made sure no one would ever find them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the lead man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. If that's true, then you're coming with us, he said. No one's going anywhere, Mr. Harris said, stepping between them. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that made even the armed men hesitate. Jake felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. This was it, the moment everything would come to a head. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't end quietly. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, a third figure appeared. It was the man in the suit, the one Jake had seen talking to Mr. Harris days ago. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence commanding, and the men at the door froze. That's enough, the man said, his voice calm but authoritative. You've made your point. Now it's time to leave. The men hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. But after a moment, they stepped back, retreating toward their SUV. This isn't over, one of them said, his voice low and menacing. It is for now, the man in the suit replied. As the SUV roared away, Jake finally let out the breath he'd been holding. The man in the suit turned to Mr. Harris, his expression unreadable. You should have called me sooner, he said. I didn't think it would come to this, Mr. Harris replied. The man nodded, then glanced at Jake. And who's this? Just a kid who got curious, Mr. Harris said. The man in the suit smiled faintly. Curiosity can be dangerous, he said. Jake didn't know what to say. He felt like he was standing in the middle of a movie, except it was all real. As the man in the suit turned to leave, he paused. You did the right thing, Harris, he said. But you know this isn't the end. I know, Mr. Harris replied. And with that, the man disappeared into the night, leaving Jake with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, Mr. Harris wasn't just a retired veteran. He was a man with a past, a man who had made sacrifices to protect something far bigger than himself. Jake didn't know if he'd ever learn the full truth, but as he walked away from the house that night, he felt a newfound respect for the old man who had once seemed so ordinary. Mr. Harris wasn't just a hero. He was a survivor, a protector, and a reminder that some battles never truly end. Mr. Harris didn't even glance at the photo. You know I don't have it, he said. I destroyed it years ago. The man's jaw tightened. We both know that's a lie. If you'd destroyed it, we wouldn't be here. Jake felt his stomach drop. Whatever it was clearly something important, something worth sending armed men to retrieve. The second man stepped forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. This is your last warning, he said. Hand it over, or we'll tear this place apart until we find it. Mr. Harris didn't flinch. You can try, he said. But you won't like what happens next. The tension was unbearable. Jake's palms were sweaty, and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. He couldn't believe how calm Mr. Harris was, standing there like he had nothing to lose. Then, just as the men seemed ready to force their way inside, the woman stepped forward. Stop, she said, her voice trembling but determined. Everyone turned to look at her, and Jake saw something in her expression that he hadn't noticed before: fear, yes, but also resolve. You're wasting your time, she said, addressing the men. The files you're looking for aren't here. They never were. The lead man frowned. And you are? She's nobody, Mr. Harris said quickly, but the woman shook her head. I'm his daughter, she said, her voice steady now. And I know the truth about what you're looking for. Jake's eyes widened. Daughter! This was the first he'd heard of Mr. Harris having any family. But before he could process the revelation, the woman continued. The files were destroyed, she said. But not by him. By me. The men exchanged a glance, clearly caught off guard. Why should we believe you? One of them asked. Because I was there, she said. I saw what happened. And I made sure no one would ever find them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the lead man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. If that's true, then you're coming with us, he said. No one's going anywhere, Mr. Harris said, stepping between them. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that made even the armed men hesitate. Jake felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. This was it, the moment everything would come to a head. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't end quietly. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, a third figure appeared. It was the man in the suit, the one Jake had seen talking to Mr. Harris days ago. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence commanding, and the men at the door froze. That's enough, the man said, his voice calm but authoritative. You've made your point. Now it's time to leave. The men hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. But after a moment, they stepped back, retreating toward their SUV. This isn't over, one of them said, his voice low and menacing. It is for now, the man in the suit replied. As the SUV roared away, Jake finally let out the breath he'd been holding. The man in the suit turned to Mr. Harris, his expression unreadable. You should have called me sooner, he said. I didn't think it would come to this, Mr. Harris replied. The man nodded, then glanced at Jake. And who's this? Just a kid who got curious, Mr. Harris said. The man in the suit smiled faintly. Curiosity can be dangerous, he said. Jake didn't know what to say. He felt like he was standing in the middle of a movie, except it was all real. As the man in the suit turned to leave, he paused. You did the right thing, Harris, he said. But you know this isn't the end. I know, Mr. Harris replied. And with that, the man disappeared into the night, leaving Jake with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, Mr. Harris wasn't just a retired veteran. He was a man with a past, a man who had made sacrifices to protect something far bigger than himself. Jake didn't know if he'd ever learn the full truth, but as he walked away from the house that night, he felt a newfound respect for the old man who had once seemed so ordinary. Mr. Harris wasn't just a hero. He was a survivor, a protector, and a reminder that some battles never truly end. Jake couldn't shake the events of the past few days. As he walked home that night, his mind raced with everything he'd learned and everything that still didn't make sense. Who was the man in the suit? What were those files, and why were they so important? And most of all, what kind of life had Mr. Harris lived to find himself at the center of something so dangerous, even after all these years? The next morning, Jake decided to pay Mr. Harris another visit. He knew he might not get all the answers, but he felt like he owed it to the old man to at least say thank you, and maybe, just maybe, to understand him a little better. When Jake arrived, the house was quiet, the porch empty. For a moment, he wondered if Mr. Harris had already left, deciding it was safer to disappear. But as he approached the door, it opened, and Mr. Harris stepped out, looking as calm and composed as ever. Back again? Mr. Harris said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I just wanted to check on you, Jake said. And, well, to ask a few more questions. Mr. Harris sighed but didn't seem annoyed. Instead, he gestured for Jake to sit on the porch. You're persistent. I'll give you that, he said. Jake sat down, unsure where to start. That man in the suit, he said finally. Who is he? An old friend, Mr. Harris replied. Or as close to a friend as you can have in this line of work. What work? Jake asked, unable to hide his curiosity. For a moment, Mr. Harris didn't answer. He stared out at the street, his eyes distant. Let's just say, I used to be part of something bigger, he said. Something that required sacrifices most people can't imagine. Jake nodded, sensing that was as much as he was going to get. And the files? What were they? Mr. Harris hesitated, then said, proof. Of things that shouldn't have happened. Things that could ruin a lot of lives if they ever came to light. Why not just destroy them? Jake asked. I tried, Mr. Harris said. But some things have a way of coming back, no matter how hard you try to bury them. Jake fell silent, trying to process everything. He wanted to ask more, but he could tell Mr. Harris wasn't going to give him all the details. And maybe that was for the best. After a while, Mr. Harris stood up. "You've got a good heart, kid," he said. "But this isn't your fight. Go live your life. Don't let curiosity drag you into something you're not ready for." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure he could just walk away from everything he'd learned. Still, he respected Mr. Harris too much to push any further. As Jake walked home, he thought about what Mr. Harris had said. Maybe it wasn't his fight, but he couldn't help feeling like he'd been changed by everything that had happened. He saw the world differently now, more complicated, more dangerous, but also full of people willing to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Over the next few weeks, Jake tried to go back to his normal routine. He went to work, hung out with his friends, and tried not to think too much about Mr. Harris or the men who had come after him. But every now and then, he found himself glancing toward the old man's house, wondering if he was still there, still watching, still waiting for whatever came next. One day, Jake noticed a moving truck parked in front of the house. His heart sank as he realized what it meant. Mr. Harris was leaving. Jake hurried over, hoping to catch him before he disappeared for good. When he arrived, he saw Mr. Harris loading a few boxes into the back of the truck. "You're leaving?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. "It's time," Mr. Harris said. "Things have gotten too hot around here. I need to keep moving." Jake nodded, though he hated the thought of never seeing Mr. Harris again. "Will you be okay?" he asked. Mr. Harris smiled. "I've made it this far, haven't I?" Jake managed a small smile in return. "I'm going to miss you," he said. Mr. Harris placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he said. "Keep using it. And remember, not every question needs an answer." With that, Mr. Harris climbed into the truck and drove away, leaving Jake standing on the sidewalk, feeling a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. In the days that followed, Jake thought a lot about Mr. Harris and everything he'd learned. He realized that some mysteries were better left unsolved, and that sometimes the most important thing wasn't knowing all the answers, but learning to live with the questions. And though he never saw Mr. Harris again, Jake knew he'd never forget the lessons he'd learned from the old man: the value of courage, the cost of secrets, and the power of standing up for what you believe in, no matter the odds. In the end, Jake didn't need all the details to understand the truth. Mr. Harris wasn't just a man with a past, he was a reminder that even in a world full of shadows, there were still people willing to fight for the light. And that was a story worth holding on to.